This happened back in the fall of 2018. Me and 3 buddies, Tyler, Ryan, and Ben, drove out to a pretty remote state park in northern Pennsylvania. We wanted to get away from the crowded, touristy campgrounds, so we picked a spot deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from any real town. The nearest fully staffed ranger station was almost an hour down a winding dirt road. About a quarter mile from where we pitched our tents, we found this old, smaller ranger outpost. It was clearly abandoned. The windows were covered in thick plywood, and the front door had a heavy chain wrapped around the handle, secured with a rusted padlock. It looked like it hadn't been touched in 20 years. We took a couple of pictures, made a few jokes about it looking like the start of a bad horror movie, and then headed back to camp. The first night was completely normal. We built a fire, grilled some food, and went to bed around midnight. The only sound was the wind moving through the pines. The next morning, though, things got weird. Ryan went to grab his pack, which he'd left zipped up and leaning against a tree near the fire pit. It was now sitting about 10 feet away, in the middle of a small clearing. It wasn't just unzipped. The contents, his extra clothes, flashlight and MREs, were laid out on the grass. Nothing was missing, and nothing was chewed on. It didn't look like a bear or a raccoon had gotten into it. It looked like someone had deliberately arranged everything. We assumed Ryan or Tyler had gotten drunk and done it as a stupid prank, even though both of them swore they hadn't. Except when Ryan finished packing it all back up, he noticed one thing was missing: his heavy-duty, orange-handled hunting knife. We tried to shake it off, but the second night made us all deeply uncomfortable. Around 11 p.m., the woods went completely dead silent. No insects, no owls, nothing. That's when Ben pointed through the trees toward the old ranger station. A faint, steady orange glow was coming through a gap in one of the boarded-up windows. It looked exactly like a flashlight or a lantern moving around inside. None of us wanted to hike through the dark to investigate, so we decided to check it out first thing in the morning. When Tyler and I walked over after sunrise, everything looked exactly the same as the day before. The plywood was securely nailed down, and the heavy chain on the door was still locked tight and covered in rust. But as I peered through the exact gap in the window where we'd seen the light, my stomach dropped. Inside, sitting on a dusty counter directly in front of the window, was Ryan's orange-handled hunting knife. It was laid out perfectly straight, completely clean. There was absolutely no way a person could have gotten inside without breaking the chain, yet the knife was sitting right there. That third night was when things turned terrifying. At around 2:30 a.m., I woke up to a sound right outside my tent. It was a slow, heavy scraping noise against the dirt and leaves. It sounded like someone was deliberately dragging something heavy, like a sack, right past our rainfly. The footsteps were rhythmic, but every few seconds the noise would stop entirely. It felt like whoever it was pausing to listen, making sure we were still asleep. I reached out and tapped Tyler on the shoulder. He was already awake, staring at the tent wall, completely frozen. We lay there in the freezing air, terrified to even breathe loudly. The scraping noise slowly circled our tents twice. Then it stopped right in the middle of our campsite, right between our tent and the dead fire pit. We waited for the sound of footsteps walking away, or the rustle of leaves in the distance, but there was nothing. Just total, suffocating silence. Whoever it was just stood there, feet away from us, in the pitch black. Nobody slept for the rest of the night. When the sun finally came up, we all got out of our tents at the same time. Nobody said a word about what happened. But as we began packing, Ben pointed at the dirt. Leading directly from the center of our campsite, right where the noise had stopped, was a deep, distinct drag mark in the dirt and crushed leaves. It trailed away from our tents and cut a straight line through the brush, leading directly toward the abandoned ranger station. We just packed up our gear in record time, skipped breakfast, and hiked back to the truck. He got visibly uncomfortable, looked away, and told me that the structure had been permanently decommissioned back in the 90s after a violent incident involving a former ranger who refused to leave the property. He wouldn't say anything else and abruptly walked away. We never went back to those woods, and to this day, I still wonder what was standing out there in the dark, waiting for us to open the tent. This happened about 2 years ago, back in late October. My cousin Danny and I have a tradition of going on a deep woods camping trip every fall. We've been doing it for years, usually trying to find places as far away from civilization as possible. That year, Danny picked a remote pocket of national forest out in eastern Oregon. It was peak deer season, and since Danny wanted to do some hunting without constantly bumping into other orange-vested hikers, we decided to push well past where the maintained trails ended. We hiked in about 6 miles carrying full packs. By the time the sun started dipping behind the ridgeline, the temperature dropped fast, and our legs were burning. We finally found a decent flat clearing near a dry creek bed and decided to make camp there. We spent the next hour doing the usual routine, setting up the 3-person tent, gathering a massive pile of fallen pine and birch for firewood, and heating up some canned chili over the camp stove. It was completely normal. We sat around the fire, talked about our jobs, and watched the stars. By 10:30 p.m., the exhaustion from the hike caught up to us, so we put out the embers and crawled into our sleeping bags. I woke up sometime around 2:30 a.m. The forest was dead silent, except for one thing. It was a rhythmic, deliberate scraping sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It sounded like someone was dragging a dull knife or a sharp rock against tree bark, maybe 30 feet from our tent. I froze, listening to it for a minute before nudging Danny awake. He sat up instantly, reaching for his headlamp. We both listened in the pitch black as the scraping continued, steady and unhurried. Finally, Danny unzipped the mesh window just an inch and clicked on his high-powered flashlight, sweeping the beam toward the sound. The light illuminated a massive ponderosa pine at the edge of the clearing. There was nothing there, no bear, no porcupine, no person. But the second the beam hit the trunk, the scraping stopped instantly. It didn't taper off, it just ceased, like whatever was doing it reacted directly to the light. We stared into the woods for another 10 minutes, but the silence didn't break. We rationalized it as a small animal that got spooked, and eventually, we managed to drift back to sleep. The next morning, the sun made the fear from the night before feel stupid, but curiosity got the better of us while the coffee was brewing, and we walked over to that pine tree. What we found made my stomach drop. Carved fresh into the bark, right at chest height, were rows of tally marks. They were small, precise, and neatly grouped in 5s. Dozens of them stretched nearly the full width of the trunk. I ran my finger over them. The exposed wood underneath was still pale and moist. Someone had been standing right there in the dark, carving these into the tree while we slept. I wanted to pack up right then, but Danny insisted we stay. He reasoned that we had a rifle, we were miles out, and it was probably just some weird local hunter messing with us. I let myself get talked into it. That second night, the atmosphere was completely different. We kept the fire blazing late, both of us sitting in a tense silence. Around 1 a.m., we finally retreated to the tent. We had been lying there for less than 20 minutes when we heard it. Footsteps, coming from the direction of the marked tree. They were slow, heavy thuds on the dry pine needles. Whoever it was kept stopping, as if they were listening to see if we were awake. Danny quietly racked a round into his hunting rifle and held it across his lap. The footsteps started up again, coming right into our clearing, closer and closer, until they stopped just 3 feet from the thin nylon wall of our tent. Then came the breathing. It was heavy, uneven, and incredibly close. Danny didn't hesitate. He yelled at the top of his lungs, "I have a gun! Back the hell off right now!" For 3 agonizing seconds, everything went dead silent. Then, the ground erupted. We didn't hear one person run away. We heard multiple sets of heavy footsteps suddenly take off sprinting in entirely different directions into the darkness, crashing through the brush until the sound faded into the distance. There hadn't been just one person standing outside. We sat back to back with the rifle raised until the sun came up. The moment it was light enough to see, we packed our gear in total silence, both of us desperate to get out of those woods. As we hoisted our packs and started the trek back to the truck, we passed by the ponderosa pine one last time. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. The tallies were still there, but right at the very end of the row, there was a single, fresh, pale scratch. A new mark, added sometime after we had gone inside the tent the night before. Neither of us has ever gone back to that forest. Danny still has a photo of the tree on his phone, and every once in a while when we're having a drink, he'll pull it out and just stare at it, without saying a word. A couple of summers ago, I decided to take a solo backpacking trip through a dense stretch of state forest. It was a 2-day loop I'd done once before, popular enough to feel safe, but remote enough to actually get some peace. I started hiking around noon, pacing myself as the trail cut deep into the pine and hardwood. By 6 p.m., the air was cooling down, and my shoulders were aching from the pack. I found a small, level clearing about 50 yards off the main trail, surrounded by thick brush. I went through the usual, comforting routine, pitching my one-man tent, gathering a few dry branches, and boiling water for a freeze-dried meal. As the sun dipped below the tree line, the standard daytime forest sounds faded into that heavy, oppressive quiet you only get deep in the woods. I checked my gear, made sure my bear canister was secure, and crawled into my sleeping bag around 9:30 p.m. I woke up abruptly at 1:14 a.m. I know the exact time because I checked my watch, trying to figure out what had startled me. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no crickets. Then I heard it. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a child crying. It wasn't a faint echo. It sounded like a young kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old, in deep, ragged gasps. It was coming from the tree line, maybe 50 feet from my tent. Instinct took over. I threw open my sleeping bag, unzipped the tent mesh, and stepped out into the freezing night air. I clicked on my tactical flashlight, sweeping the beam across the dark wall of pines, and yelled out, "Hey, is someone out there? Are you okay?" The moment the last word left my mouth, the stop dead. The sudden silence was deafening. I stood there, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly against the bark of the trees. I waited for a response. Nothing. Then, after about 10 agonizing seconds, the started again. But it hadn't just resumed. It had moved. It was now coming from a dense thicket far to my left, easily 100 yards away. There was no way a child could have navigated that brush in pitch blackness, completely silently, and that fast. I called out again, my voice cracking slightly. "Hello? Do you need help?" Again, the crying cut off instantly. It was like a switch being flipped. Whatever was making that sound was listening to me. It was reacting specifically to my voice. Then, the crying started a third time, and this time it was terrifyingly close. It was barely 20 feet away, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's glow, and along with the sobbing, I could hear the distinct, rhythmic crunch of small, fast footsteps snapping twigs in the underbrush. They were moving directly toward my clearing. I backed into my tent, zipped the rainfly shut with trembling hands, and sat cross-legged on my sleeping pad. I turned off the flashlight to save the battery, gripping a small camping knife, completely blind in the dark. That was when the real nightmare began. For the next 20 minutes, I was trapped in total paralysis. That didn't just stay in one place. It began a slow, deliberate patrol around the thin nylon walls of my tent. It would softly on the north side, right behind where my head had been resting, a low, wet weeping that sounded close enough to touch. My breath hitched, my chest aching from trying to stay absolutely silent. Then, without any sound of movement through the leaves, the wood instantly emit a sharp, sudden gasp from the opposite side of the camp, right near the entrance. Every time I thought I had mapped where it was, the sound would shift, defying the physical layout of the woods. The worst part was the pacing. The crying would fade out into a suffocating, minute-long silence, where the only sound was the heavy thudding of my own pulse in my ears. I'd start to convince myself it was over. Then, a twig would snap right outside the canvas, inches away, followed by a shallow, ragged intake of breath, like a child catching their wind before a fresh bout of tears. I sat there in the dark, squeezing the handle of the knife so hard my fingers went numb, staring at the pitch-black walls, terrified that a silhouette was about to press against the fabric. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sound stopped altogether. I didn't sleep a single second for the rest of the night. I sat there, staring at the tent wall until the canvas slowly turned from black to a pale, morning gray. As soon as there was enough light to see, I didn't even bother making coffee or packing properly. I stuffed my sleeping bag and tent into my pack in a chaotic mess, and hiked the remaining miles back to my truck at a frantic pace. To this day, I can't shake the memory of how perfectly human that crying sounded, and how utterly inhuman it was that it knew exactly where I was.